My rich father humiliated my adopted daughter at Thanksgiving, calling her a genetic stray, so I destroyed his empire with 3 words he never saw coming. I am Lily's mother, not her stepmother, her mother. My husband Ethan died in a car crash when she was 6. I had loved her since she was 2 years old, since the first time she fell asleep on my chest at Ethan's apartment in Medford, and I decided I would never let go of her, no matter what happened to us as a couple. After Ethan passed, I spent a year in family court making it official. Home studies, background checks, a guardian ad litem who interviewed Lily 3 separate times to make sure she understood what the word forever meant. She was mine on paper and mine in every other way that mattered, and I framed the adoption decree the day it came through and hung it in the hallway across from her bedroom door, so it would be the last thing she saw before she went to sleep, and the first thing she saw when she woke up. My father, Walter Hale, never accepted that. He built half the skyline in Boston, or close enough that he believed it. He worships bloodlines the way other men worship God, and he checks property values the way other men check their pulse. Every Christmas, my sister Diane's kids, Preston and Ashley, got new laptops, new phones, envelopes stuffed with $100 bills. Lily got a plain gift card to a bookstore, $25, still in its cardboard sleeve. I stayed quiet about it for 4 years. I wanted her to have a grandfather. I wanted her to have more family than just me. I was wrong to want that, and it took one dinner to prove it to me in a way I couldn't unsee. Last Thanksgiving, Walter finally said the quiet part out loud. We were at his townhouse on Mount Vernon Street, 12 of us packed around a table built for 10, the good china out, a caterer moving quietly along the wall refilling water glasses. Walter stood at the head of the table with 2 fingers of scotch in a crystal tumbler and announced, in the middle of dessert, that he was finalizing his estate plan before the end of the year. He said his money was going into trusts for blood relatives only. He said the word legacy, like it was a religious term. Then he looked straight down the table at my 10-year-old daughter, who was still holding her fork over a half-eaten slice of pumpkin pie. The family money is not going to subsidize a genetic stray, he said. The table went dead silent. Somewhere behind me, the caterer stopped pouring water. Lily's fork hit her plate with a small, terrible clink. My sister Diane didn't even flinch. She just sipped her wine like her father hadn't gutted a 10-year-old child in front of 11 witnesses and a hired staff. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward and cracked against the hardwood. She is your granddaughter, I said. My voice didn't shake. I remember being surprised by that, how steady it came out, when everything inside me was on fire. Walter laughed at me. Not a big laugh. A short, dismissive huff through his nose, the kind he used to give contractors who brought him bad news. She's a charity case you took on because you couldn't move on after Ethan died, he said. I've indulged it for 4 years, Claire. I'm not obligated to indulge it forever. I grabbed Lily's hand and told her quietly to get her coat from the front closet. Walter lost whatever composure he had left. He hurled his crystal tumbler into the fireplace behind us, and it shattered against the brick with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in that quiet, expensive room. Glass rained down onto the hardwood, onto the edge of the rug, close enough to our shoes that Lily screamed and grabbed my leg with both arms, burying her face in my hip. I didn't look back at him. I didn't say another word. I walked her out the front door, past the caterer standing frozen with a water pitcher in her hand, past Diane's husband Roger staring down at his plate like it held the answer to something, and I got Lily into the car and blocked my father's number before we even hit the highway. I thought that was the worst night of my life. I had no idea what he had already set in motion, weeks before that dinner even started. I was 34 that fall. I worked as a senior forensic accountant at a firm called Whitfield & Cross, out of an office on Summer Street, the kind of job where I spent my days finding the exact dollar amount that someone else had hoped nobody would ever notice was missing. I was good at it. I had built a career out of not letting people lie to me with numbers. It never once occurred to me that the person I'd eventually have to use those skills against would be my own father. Ethan and I met when Lily was 2. He was a single father by then, Rosa having left when Lily was 8 months old, disappearing into a life of shelters and relapses and half-hearted attempts at recovery that never stuck. Ethan never badmouthed her to Lily. He just quietly became both parents, and I fell in love with the 2 of them as a package, not as a man with a complication attached. We married when Lily was 4. Ethan died 2 years later, on a rain-slicked stretch of Route 93 outside Medford, on a Tuesday in October, on his way home from picking up a birthday cake for a party we never got to have. Lily was 6. I was 29, a widow with a 6-year-old who had already lost one mother to addiction, and now a father to a semi-truck that hydroplaned across 3 lanes. I had no legal claim to her at all, not one. Ethan had never formally adopted her either, not through any fault of his own, just the ordinary procrastination of people who think they have decades left. Without a piece of paper, Lily could have been sent to live with Rosa, wherever Rosa was that year, or with a Delgado relative none of us had ever met, or into the foster system while everyone sorted it out. I spent the next year in family court instead of grieving my husband, home studies, a background check that dug into every parking ticket I'd ever gotten, a guardian ad litem named Ms. Okafor who sat with Lily 3 separate times, alone, asking her in age-appropriate language whether she understood that this decision, once made, would never be undone. Lily told her at 7 years old, I already decided. She's my mom. We just need the judge to catch up. I still have the transcript. I've read it more times than I can count. My father came to exactly one of those hearings. He He sat in the back row of the courtroom in a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage, checked his watch 4 times that I counted, and left before the recess without saying a word to either of us. Afterward, at a diner near the courthouse, I asked him what he thought. He said, "You're a good person for doing this, Claire. Just don't expect me to treat it the same as real family. Blood is blood." I laughed it off at the time. I told myself he was old-fashioned, that he'd come around once he actually spent time with her. He never did. The pattern set itself early and never moved. At Lily's 8th birthday party in my backyard in Somerville, my mother, Eleanor, spent 2 hours on the ground helping Lily build a fairy garden out of moss and broken pottery. Walter stood by the grill with a beer he didn't finish, and when my neighbor Carol asked him pleasantly if he was excited to be a grandfather twice over now, he said, "We'll see how things shake out," and changed the subject to a zoning dispute downtown. I heard him say it. Lily, thankfully, was 30 feet away, digging in the dirt, and didn't. My mother was different. Eleanor Hale had married Walter in 1979 and spent 42 years learning exactly how much of herself she was allowed to keep. But with Lily, she never held back. She called her my girl without qualification. She kept a drawer of art supplies at her house labeled, in her own handwriting, Lily's drawer, and it sat right next to the one labeled Preston and Ashley. Same size, same care. When Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the winter after Lily's adoption was finalized, she spent some of her last clear-headed weeks not arguing with doctors, but arguing with her own estate attorney, a meticulous man named Frank Delacroix, about specific language in a trust she was setting up for her grandchildren. I didn't understand the significance of that argument until much later. At the time, I only knew that my mother, dying, insisted on a single afternoon meeting at the house on Mount Vernon Street, where she made Frank read a paragraph back to her 3 times before she'd sign anything. Walter sat in on that meeting too, distracted, on his phone half the time, mumbling something about a permitting delay on a project in the seaport. Eleanor died that March, 5 years after Lily came into our lives. 4 years before that Thanksgiving dinner blew everything apart. I remember standing at her graveside thinking that whatever she had built to protect Lily, Walter had barely registered it happening. He'd been thinking about steel prices while his wife negotiated her granddaughter's future. That should have told me something. It didn't. Not fully. Not yet. Grief has a way of making you generous with the people who've disappointed you, because you're too busy being disappointed by the one person you can no longer be angry at. I spent the years after my mother's death giving my father chance after chance, telling myself that losing Eleanor had hollowed him out, that his coldness toward Lily was really just an old man's inability to process how much his family had changed shape. I made excuses for him at every holiday, every awkward birthday call. Every year his gift to Lily arrived smaller and less thoughtful than the year before. I told myself the story where he came around eventually. I did not yet understand that Walter Hale didn't operate on stories. He operated on ledgers, and in his ledger, my daughter had never been entered as an asset. She had only ever been entered as a liability he tolerated because tolerating me came with it. The first sign came 11 days after Thanksgiving, in the form of an email from Walter's assistant, Mitchell Vance, a soft-spoken man who had worked for my father for almost 15 years and who I liked despite everything. Since Lily was 6, Walter had been contributing $2,000 a month to a 529 education account in her name, an arrangement he'd set up himself, unprompted, back when he was still trying to look like the kind of grandfather who did such things. Mitchell's email was 3 sentences long. It said the December contribution would not be processing. It said Mr. Hale was reevaluating certain discretionary commitments in light of his estate restructuring. It did not use the word Lily once. I stared at that email for a long time before I closed my laptop. $24,000 a year isn't the kind of money that changes whether my daughter eats or has a roof over her head. I made good money. I could cover her education without him. But that wasn't the point, and Walter knew it wasn't the point. The point was that he could reach into her future with 2 fingers and simply lift something out of it, the same casual way he'd hurled a crystal tumbler into his own fireplace, and there was nothing I could do to stop him, because none of it had ever legally belonged to her in the first place. It was a gift. Gifts can be taken back. That was the lesson he wanted me to learn. The second escalation arrived 9 days later, wearing my sister's face. Diane showed up at my house in Somerville on a Sunday afternoon, uninvited, sitting in my kitchen with her coat still on like she didn't plan to stay long enough to need it off. She told me Dad felt terrible about how things had gotten out of hand at Thanksgiving. She told me he was 70 years old and grieving Mom more than any of us realized, and that grief made people say ugly things they didn't mean. She told me I needed to think about the bigger picture, about Preston and Ashley growing up without their aunt around, about how petty it would look someday if I let one bad night at a dinner table destroy an entire family over what was, in her words, honestly, a figure of speech. He called her a genetic stray, Diane, I said. There's no version of that sentence that's a figure of speech. You're always so literal, she said. And I remember that phrase specifically because it was the first time I understood that my sister had decided somewhere along the way that keeping peace with our father was worth more to her than defending my daughter. She never once in that entire conversation asked how Lily was doing. She never once said his behavior had been wrong. She asked me to apologize to him. I told her to leave, and she did, visibly offended, like I was the one who had broken something. I told myself reasonably that I would give it time. I didn't call Walter. I didn't send Lily's Christmas thank you card that year, the one my mother used to insist on. I simply went quiet, the way you go quiet around around a wound you're hoping will close on its own if you stop touching it. Walter, it turned out, wasn't interested in letting a wound close. He tried a different tactic 3 weeks before Christmas, calling me directly for the first time since Thanksgiving, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years, almost fragile. He told me he'd had some chest pain the week before, a scare, nothing his cardiologist was too worried about, but enough to make a man think about his mortality. He said he wanted one more Christmas as a family, all of us, no hard feelings, and for one long moment, sitting alone in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, I let myself believe he meant it. I told him I'd think about bringing Lily. He said, good, wonderful. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that it would mean a great deal to him if Lily wrote him a card, a thank you card, he specified, for the trust distributions he'd been making all these years. Something with her signature on it, something formal. So it's on the record that she appreciated what the family has done for her. I asked him what he meant by on the record. He laughed it off, said I was overthinking a sentimental old man's request, and changed the subject to whether I was still seeing anyone. Walter, I said, pulling him back, if you want a relationship with her, build one. Show up. Take her to the aquarium. You don't need a signed card for that. You've always made things harder than they need to be, Claire, he said, and there was an edge under the softness now, the fragile old man voice cracking just slightly to show the older, colder one underneath it. I'm trying to include her. I'd think you'd be grateful instead of suspicious. I'd be grateful if you meant it, I said, and he let the silence sit there for a second too long before he laughed again and told me not to overthink things, that he'd see us at Christmas, and hung up before I could push further. I hung up feeling something cold settle in my stomach that I couldn't name yet. It would be months before I understood exactly what he had been trying to get my 10-year-old to sign, and why a handwritten thank you note mattered enough to a man worth 11 figures that he'd fake a health scare to get one. I didn't bring Lily to Christmas. I told him she had a stomach bug. He didn't call again after that, and for 2 months, an uneasy silence settled over the family, the kind where everyone quietly picks a side without announcing it out loud. Diane sent a single group text on New Year's Eve that said, "Miss you guys. Hope 2025 is good to everyone," which Walter liked with a thumbs up, and I didn't respond to at all. Then on a Tuesday morning in late February, a process server knocked on my door before I'd even had coffee. He handed me a manila envelope and asked me to confirm my name before he'd release it into my hands, the way they do when they want to be able to swear under oath later that service was proper. Inside was a custody petition. Rosa Delgado, Lily's biological mother, a woman who had not called, written, texted, or shown up once in 8 years, was petitioning the Massachusetts Family Court to overturn my adoption of Lily on the grounds that it had been improperly finalized, that she had never truly relinquished her parental rights with informed consent, and that she was now, per the filing, in stable recovery and prepared to resume full custody of her daughter. I read it standing in my doorway in my socks, the cold air coming in around me, and I felt the floor tilt under my feet in a way it hadn't since the state trooper had called me about Ethan 4 years earlier. I called out of work. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and read the 12 pages twice more, looking for anything that made sense, and finding nothing. Rosa had disappeared so completely that I'd stopped being able to picture her face without effort, and now she wanted her daughter back, out of nowhere, represented by an actual attorney, on a filing that alleged legal defects in a process that 3 separate court officials, including a judge, had signed off on. I emptied $9,000 out of my savings that same afternoon and called every family law attorney whose name I could find until I reached a man named Harold Pierce, working out of a small office above a bakery in Cambridge, recommended by a coworker whose own custody fight he'd handled without losing. Harold was quiet, sharp-eyed, and cheap with his words in a way that made me trust him immediately, the way you trust someone who clearly isn't performing concern for your benefit. I told him everything. The adoption, Ethan, the years of silence from Rosa, and then, almost reluctantly, I told him about Thanksgiving, about the tumbler in the fireplace, about the words genetic stray. Harold's expression didn't change while I talked, but when I got to the part about Walter's estate restructuring, he set down his pen. How exactly, he asked, is a woman who's been off the grid for 8 years, currently in a recovery program, affording a retainer for a custody attorney with a filing fee and expert witnesses lined up? I didn't have an answer. I hadn't even thought to ask the question. Harold told me to sit still, to keep my head down, to not contact Walter under any circumstances, and to let him find out. He spent 3 weeks digging through everything he could subpoena or request before our first mediation date, and he told me almost nothing about what he was finding, just that I should trust him and show up ready to let him do the talking. On the morning of the mediation, I dropped Lily at school without telling her where I was going, kissed the top of her head an extra second longer than usual, and drove to a nondescript office building in Woburn with my stomach in knots. The mediation room was cold and too brightly lit, the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly ill. Rosa sat across the table from me in a wrinkled blazer that didn't quite fit her, checking her phone under the table like she was waiting for someone to tell her she could leave. She didn't look like a woman fighting to get her daughter back. She looked like someone counting down a clock, and something about that, more than anything in the 12-page filing, made the hair on my arms stand up. Harold started soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "What's Lily's middle name?" he asked Rosa directly. Rosa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her lawyer, a young man I hadn't caught the the name of shifted in his seat. What is she severely allergic to? Harold continued, his voice never rising. The thing that could put her in the hospital in 10 minutes if she's exposed to it. Silence again. Rosa's eyes dropped to the table. The mediator, a woman with reading glasses, pushed up into gray hair, glanced up from her notepad for the first time. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Then Harold opened a manila folder and slid a stack of bank statements across the table like he was dealing cards. 3 weeks before you filed this petition, he said, addressing Rosa directly now, you received a wire transfer for $25,000 into an account you opened the same month. The transfer originated from a company called Crestline Holdings LLC. Rosa's face drained of color. Her lawyer reached for the papers, scanning them too fast to actually be reading them. Crestline Holdings, Harold continued, is a Delaware shell entity. Its registered agent is a law firm in Boston that has represented exactly one client for the last 11 years. Walter Hale, my client's father, your daughter's grandfather. Nobody in that room moved for a full 3 seconds. The mediator's pen stopped mid-note. Rosa's hands began to shake, the phone she'd been holding under the table clattering onto the surface. Tears spilled down her face, fast and ugly. Nothing performed about them. He found me, she whispered, 6 months ago. He tracked me down through my sponsor. I don't even know how. He said this was the last piece he needed for something bigger, some kind of restructuring. He said there was $50,000 more waiting if I actually won custody. I have a kid I haven't seen since she was a baby and a rent payment I'm 3 weeks behind on. I'm not proud of it. I said yes. My stomach turned over so violently I thought I might be sick right there at the table. My own father had paid a stranger, a woman with almost nothing, to try to tear my daughter out of my arms, purely to prove that blood beat love in whatever ledger he kept in his head. It wasn't cruelty as an outburst anymore. It was cruelty as a project, with a budget and a timeline and a shell company. The mediator closed her folder with a sharp snap. This session is terminated, she said, already reaching for her own phone. I'm referring this entire matter to the presiding judge, effective immediately, along with a note recommending the district attorney's office review it for possible fraud on the court. I should have felt relief flood through me. Instead, I felt a cold drop low in my chest, because Rosa wasn't finished, and something in the way she said it told me the worst part hadn't arrived yet. Security stepped forward to escort her out, standard procedure once a mediation collapses like that, but she twisted back toward me at the door, eyes wide, words tumbling out fast before anyone could stop her. He told me this was never really about your daughter, she said. He told me there's something bigger coming, something you don't even know about yet, something with his company. Before I could ask her what she meant, the door behind her swung open hard enough to hit the wall. A man in a gray suit stepped into the room, breathing like he'd taken the stairs 2 at a time, holding a leather briefcase stamped in gold with the Hale Development Group logo. It took me a second to place him. Mitchell Vance, Walter's assistant of 15 years, the same man who had emailed me 11 days after Thanksgiving to cancel a $529 contribution, standing in a family court mediation room he had absolutely no business being in. He looked around at the wreckage of the room, at Rosa being led out in tears, at the mediator on her phone, at Harold's stack of bank statements still spread across the table, and something shifted across his face, a calculation happening in real time behind his eyes. Then he looked directly at me, set the briefcase down on the table with a heavy, deliberate click, and said the sentence that made the floor drop out from under me all over again. Mr. Hale needs your signature on this today, Mitchell said. The bank moved the deadline up. He said to tell you it's just a formality. Given the family situation, I didn't move. Harold reached over, unlatched the briefcase before I could stop him, and lifted out a slim, professionally bound document. On the cover page, in a serif font I recognized from a dozen holiday cards over the years, it read, First Amendment to the Eleanor R. Hale Family Trust. I sat there staring at my mother's name on a document she had never seen, would never see, and felt the last piece I hadn't known I was missing click horribly into place. Harold flipped through it fast, his eyes moving line by line, and I watched his expression go from professional focus to something harder, something almost like recognition. He turned the document toward me and tapped one clause with 2 fingers. Your mother's trust, he said quietly, defines descendants to include any child legally adopted by a descendant, whether adopted before or after the trust's execution. Your mother wrote that language in herself. It means Lily is a full beneficiary, equal footing with Preston and Ashley, equal footing with you and Diane. I remembered suddenly, with a clarity that felt like being struck, the meeting 5 years earlier, my mother making Frank Delacroix read a paragraph back to her 3 times before she'd sign anything. Walter distracted on his phone, mumbling about a permitting delay in the seaport. She hadn't been arguing about wording out of stubbornness. She had been protecting Lily's place in that family, in writing, permanently, the one thing she could still control on her way out of the world, and Walter had been too busy thinking about steel prices to notice what she'd actually done. And this amendment, Harold went on, holding up the document Mitchell had just tried to slide in front of me for a signature, attempts to retroactively redefine descendants as biological issue only. It would strip Lily of her beneficiary status entirely, which means it would strip her guardian, you, of any consent rights over trust decisions. He set the document down. Trust documents like this one usually require unanimous beneficiary or guardian guardian consent for major transactions, pledging trust-held shares as collateral, for instance, which tells me your father needs something pledged, badly, and needs it before someone with your daughter's interests at heart is legally in the room to say no. I looked up at Mitchell, who had gone very quiet, his eyes flicking between the briefcase and the door like he was recalculating how much trouble he was standing in the middle of. "What's the deadline?" I asked him. My voice came out flatter than I expected. "The bank deadline. What's it for?" Mitchell hesitated so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, almost like the words were coming out against his will, he said, "The Congress Street Tower. There's an $80 million construction loan. Bay State Commercial called a covenant default 2 weeks ago over cost overruns. They want additional collateral pledged by Friday, or they call the whole note. Mr. Hale's been trying to get the trust amendment executed for a month. He said your daughter's custody case would resolve itself before anyone noticed the timing. Every piece I'd been carrying separately for months. The frozen 529 account, the fake health scare, the demand for a signed thank you note, on the record, Rosa's sudden reappearance, all of it rearranged itself in front of me into a single, coherent, monstrous shape. My father hadn't humiliated my daughter at Thanksgiving because he was old and grieving and careless with his words. He had humiliated her because he needed her erased from a legal document before a bank deadline, and Thanksgiving was simply the night he'd decided to start softening the ground. I didn't confront my father that day. I let Harold handle Mitchell, watched him calmly explain that any document delivered to a represented party inside an active mediation, minutes after a fraud referral, would be preserved as evidence rather than executed, and I watched Mitchell's face go from anxious to genuinely frightened as he understood what he'd just walked into carrying his boss's briefcase. I drove home in silence, picked Lily up from her after-school program, and sat with her at the kitchen table doing math homework like the whole world hadn't just rearranged itself around us, because that's what you do. You keep the ordinary things ordinary for as long as you possibly can for their sake. But I didn't sit on what I'd learned. I spent that weekend and every night the following week doing the thing I was actually trained to do. I pulled every public record I could find on Hale Development Group and the Congress Street Tower. I called 2 former colleagues who now worked in construction finance and asked careful, hypothetical questions about covenant defaults and collateral calls. I requested, through Harold, a formal beneficiary accounting of the Eleanor R. Hale Family Trust, a legal right that existed the moment Harold's reading of that document confirmed Lily was, and had always been, a full beneficiary. Frank Delacroix, my mother's old estate attorney, still administered the trust's paperwork, and when Harold called him directly, Frank confirmed, with visible discomfort, that Walter had been quietly attempting for weeks to get an amendment executed without full beneficiary sign-off, using a secondary trustee provision he believed nobody would scrutinize closely enough to catch. He was wrong about that. I built the case the way I built every case at Whitfield and Cross, methodically, following the money instead of the story someone wanted me to believe. I traced Crestline Holdings LLC back through 2 more shell entities and found it had also received 3 payments over the prior year from a Hale Development Group subsidiary, structured just under the reporting threshold that would have triggered an automatic compliance flag at the bank. I found that the cost overruns on the Congress Street project weren't purely steal prices, as Walter had told the family at Thanksgiving. A significant chunk was an earlier draw that had been diverted, through Crestline, to cover a margin call on an entirely different failing investment Walter had made without telling his own board. My father wasn't just trying to erase my daughter from a trust document. He was trying to use family money, protected money, my mother's money, to quietly plug a hole in his own empire before anyone with real oversight noticed it was there. I called a family meeting myself 2 weeks after the mediation, at Frank Delacroix's office in the Back Bay, ostensibly to discuss the formal beneficiary accounting I'd requested. Walter showed up expecting a negotiation. Diane came too, along with Roger, both of them clearly under the impression this was some kind of family squabble that could still be smoothed over with the right tone of voice. Frank sat at the head of the conference table this time, instead of Walter, which I noticed my father clock immediately, a small muscle working in his jaw. "I want to be clear about what we're doing here," Walter said, before anyone else could speak, addressing the room like a boardroom he still controlled. "Claire is upset about a dinner conversation, and is now trying to weaponize a legal technicality to punish me. I think everyone here can see that for what it is. I have the wire records for Crestline Holdings," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, not because he deserved calm, but because I did. "I have the wire to Rosa Delgado. I have the 3 transfers from the Congress Street subsidiary. I have Frank's records showing you tried to push through a trust amendment stripping Lily's beneficiary status 4 days before a bank collateral deadline, using an emergency provision you weren't authorized to invoke without unanimous consent." Diane's expression flickered, the first real crack I'd seen in her since Thanksgiving. "Dad," she said slowly, "what is she talking about?" Walter didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me, and for one moment, I saw something underneath the anger, something almost like respect, the way he might have looked at a competitor who had finally outmaneuvered him on a deal. "You have no idea what it takes to hold something like this together," he said. 40 years I built this. One bad quarter and I lose it all to a bank that doesn't care how many buildings have my name on the cornerstone. I did what any businessman would do." "You didn't do what a businessman would do," I said. "A businessman would have called his own board, or restructured the loan, or sold an asset. You paid a recovering attic $25,000 to try to take a 10-year-old away from the only stable home she's ever known, so you could quietly strip her out of a legal document before anyone could stop you. That's not business. That's fraud against a trust, fraud on a family court, and very likely fraud against a federally regulated bank, and I have documented every dollar of it. Watch your tone, Walter said, low and sharp, an old reflex. The same voice he'd used on me my whole childhood whenever I got close to a truth he didn't want spoken out loud. I'm done watching my tone around you, I said. You called my daughter a genetic stray at a table with 12 people and a hired staff listening. You tried to make her write you a thank you note so you'd have paper proof of her gratitude before you erased her. You are not a victim of a bad quarter, Walter. You are a man who used his dead wife's trust and a stranger's desperation as tools, and you got caught, and now you're going to face what that means. His face had gone a color I'd never seen on him before, somewhere between white and gray, the color of a man realizing the ground under him wasn't as solid as he'd believed. Roger had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Diane was staring at her father like she was seeing him for the first time in her adult life, which I would later understand she was. Dad, she said again, quieter this time, like the word itself had changed shape in her mouth. Tell me she's wrong. Tell me you didn't pay that woman to try to take Lily. Walter didn't answer her directly. He looked at Frank instead, at the neutral, careful expression of a man who had known this family for 2 decades and was now watching it come apart across his own conference table. Frank, Walter said, surely there's a way to handle this quietly, for the family's sake. There isn't, Walter, Frank said. It was the first thing he'd said since the meeting started, and his voice, when it finally came, carried none of the deference he'd shown my father for 20 years. Eleanor asked me more than once whether I thought you'd try something like this eventually. I told her I didn't think you'd have the nerve. I was wrong, and I think some part of her suspected I might be, which is exactly why she made me read that clause back to her 3 times. Walter's jaw worked, but nothing came out. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen my father run out of a rebuttal. So what exactly, Walter said, forcing his voice back into something steady, are you planning to do about it, Claire? Sue your own father? Drag the family name through the papers? Think about what that does to Preston and Ashley. Think about what it does to Lily, having all of this dug up and put on display. I looked at him for a long moment. I had rehearsed 100 different things to say in that meeting. Angry things, wounded things, things I'd been carrying since I was a little girl watching him ignore me in favor of a golf game. In the end, none of that was what came out. What came out was 3 words, said quietly, evenly, the way I would have said them to any subject of any audit I'd ever run in my career. You're being audited. Something in his face actually failed, the way a structure fails when the one load-bearing point finally gives. By whom, he managed. Bay State Commercial's compliance office as of yesterday morning. Once I sent them documentation of the collateral fraud attempt tied to the covenant call, I said, the Attorney General's Nonprofit Organizations and Public Charities Division, because a family trust with charitable remainder provisions falls under their jurisdiction, and Frank confirmed yours does. And Whitfield and Cross, my own firm, because I referred the Crestline transaction pattern to our financial crimes group this morning, recused myself from the engagement, and let them take it from there so nobody can ever say I used my position to settle a family score instead of doing my job correctly. I stood up the same way I had at Thanksgiving, except this time my chair didn't fall, and neither did I. You spent 40 years building an empire on the idea that blood was the only thing that mattered. It turns out paperwork mattered a great deal more, and I know how to read it better than you do. I want to say the room erupted after that, but it didn't. It went very quiet, the particular quiet of people watching a building they'd assumed was permanent begin, slowly, to lean. Walter stood up without another word and walked out of Frank's office, and none of us tried to stop him, and I remember thinking that was the first time in my entire life I had ever watched him leave a room instead of me. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected and slower than I needed them to, both at once. Bay State Commercial's compliance office froze the Congress Street Tower's remaining draw within 4 business days, which meant the crane on site went quiet, which meant a project my father had spent 3 years bragging about at every family gathering sat half-finished behind chain-link fencing, while lawyers argued over who was liable for what. The Attorney General's Charities Division opened a formal inquiry into the trust amendment attempt, and Frank, to his credit, cooperated fully, handing over 5 years of correspondence he'd apparently been quietly worried about for longer than any of us realized. Whitfield and Cross's financial crimes team traced the Crestline pattern back through 2 more shell entities, and found a third, smaller instance of diverted trust funds that had nothing to do with Lily at all, an older, separate scheme involving a cousin's education account that had been drained years earlier and never noticed. My father, it turned out, hadn't invented deception for this crisis. He'd simply been good at it for a long time, and this was the first time anyone with the right training had been angry enough and close enough to actually look. Walter's own attorney, a longtime family friend named Gerald Ostro, who had drafted 3 prior versions of his estate plan over the years, withdrew from representing him in the trust litigation that spring, filing a brief formal motion citing irreconcilable differences regarding the factual basis of the representation. I heard about it secondhand from Frank, who heard it from a clerk, but the detail that stuck with me was smaller and somehow more damning than the motion itself. At the one deposition Gerald sat through before withdrawing, Walter was asked under oath whether he had personally personally authorized the wire transfers to Crestline Holdings. He said he couldn't recall the specifics, that Mitchell handled operational details, that a man in his position couldn't be expected to track every line item. Gerald, according to the clerk, visibly winced at his own client's answer because 2 of the wires bore Walter's personal digital signature, time-stamped and notarized, sitting in the exhibit binder directly in front of him. A week later, Gerald was gone from the case, and Walter's replacement counsel, a younger associate with far less patience for creative memory, advised him within a month to settle rather than let the case reach trial. Rosa's custody petition was dismissed with prejudice within the month, the judge noting in his written order that the filing appeared to have been made in bad faith and referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review, though ultimately, given Rosa's cooperation and the clear evidence she'd been financially coerced by someone with vastly more power than her, the DA declined to pursue charges against her directly. I felt something unexpected when I read that outcome. Not forgiveness exactly, something closer to pity, and underneath the pity, a strange flicker of gratitude, because without Rosa's shaking hands and her whispered confession in that mediation room, I might never have found out what my father had actually been doing until it was too late to stop him. Diane called me 11 days after the meeting at Frank's office. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she didn't apologize right away, which I respected more than I expected to. She told me she'd spent the past week going back through old emails, old bank transfers Roger handled for their household finances, old conversations she'd dismissed at the time as normal Walter grumbling, and had found 3 separate instances where their father had asked, casually, whether Roger's firm could help move some numbers around for the Congress Street project. Roger, a compliance officer himself at a regional bank, had refused every time, quietly, without ever telling Diane why he found the requests unsettling. I think I spent so many years being the good daughter, Diane said, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her, that I trained myself not to notice when being good meant not asking questions. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm sorry about Thanksgiving. I'm sorry I told you to apologize to him. I should have been in your kitchen that day defending Lily instead of defending Dad's feelings. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Some things you can't fully walk back with a single phone call, and I told her that honestly, that it would take time before I trusted her the way I once had. But she showed up 2 weekends later at Lily's soccer game, sat in the cold with a thermos of coffee, and cheered louder than anyone else in the bleachers when Lily scored her first goal of the season, and something in me softened watching her do it, watching my sister choose finally which family she actually wanted to be part of. Walter did not go quietly. He tried, in the weeks after the audit referrals went out, to reach Lily directly, showing up unannounced outside her elementary school one afternoon in early spring, standing by the fence with a stuffed animal in his hands like a decade of near total absence could be undone with a single toy. The school called me before he ever got near her. Per the emergency contact protocols I'd updated the moment the custody petition landed on my doorstep, and I arrived to find him standing awkwardly by the flagpole, looking for the first time in my memory, genuinely lost. I told him calmly, in front of the vice principal who'd come out with me, that if he ever approached my daughter again without my explicit permission, I would seek a formal protective order, and that the choice of whether he ever saw her again as an adult, years from now, would be entirely hers to make, not his. He didn't come back after that. He tried other things too, in that strange, flailing period. He called old family friends, spinning a version of events where I had betrayed him out of jealousy over an inheritance. Most of them, having watched 30 years of Thanksgivings, didn't believe him, or believed him just enough to quietly distance themselves from the entire mess rather than pick a side. He offered, through his own attorney, to restore Lily's 529 contributions and reinstate her as a full trust beneficiary if I agreed to have the audit referrals withdrawn, a proposal so transparently self-serving that even his own attorney, according to Harold, seemed embarrassed delivering it. I said no. Not because I didn't want the money for Lily's future, but because I understood, finally and completely, that with Walter, every gift had always come with a hidden clause, and I was done signing anything with his name attached to it without reading every line 3 times. There was a night, sometime in that long, gray stretch of late winter, when I sat alone at my kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed and let myself grieve something I hadn't given myself permission to grieve yet, not Walter, as he actually was. I'd stopped mourning that version of him years earlier, somewhere around the birthday party with the fairy garden and the beer he never finished. I grieved the grandfather I had wanted for Lily, the one who never existed, the one who would have gotten down on the floor the way my mother had, who would have shown up to soccer games without an ulterior motive, who would have looked at a little girl who lost both her parents by the time she was 6 and simply loved her, uncomplicated, the way you're supposed to love a child. I cried harder that night than I had since Ethan's funeral, not for what Walter had done, but for what he had never been capable of doing in the first place. And by the time I finally went to bed, something in my chest had loosened that had been tight for 4 years. The legal aftermath dragged on for the better part of a year. Walter was removed as trustee of the Eleanor R. Hale Family Trust by court order that summer, replaced by a neutral professional trustee, and, at Frank's recommendation, myself as co-trustee, a role I accepted with a level of caution I'd never felt about anything in my life. The Congress Street Tower was eventually sold, mid-construction, to a competing developer at a steep loss, and Hale Development Group, the company that had once employed 400 people and put my father's name on 3 separate buildings, buildings, was quietly dissolved within 18 months, its remaining assets liquidated to satisfy the bank and settle the trust litigation. Walter kept the townhouse on Mount Vernon Street, and a fraction of what he'd once had, enough to live comfortably, nowhere near enough to still be the man who had once stood at the head of a Thanksgiving table and announced, like a king handing down a decree, who was and wasn't worthy of his money. The unexpected ally, when he came, surprised me more than almost anything else in that whole ordeal. Mitchell Vance called Harold's office in April, 3 months after he'd walked into that mediation room with a briefcase he clearly hadn't understood the weight of, and asked to meet. He'd resigned from Hale Development Group the week the audit started, he told us, sitting stiffly in Harold's small conference room above the bakery, his hands folded on the table like a man confessing something at church. He said he'd spent 15 years telling himself that following orders wasn't the same as doing wrong, and that watching Rosa's hands shake in that mediation room had finally cracked something open in him that he couldn't close back up. He handed over a flash drive containing internal correspondence he'd quietly archived over the years, emails where Walter had directed him to keep the Delgado situation moving and to make sure the amendment language was ready before the family noticed. Documents that closed the last gaps in the case against my father more completely than anything Harold or I had managed to piece together ourselves. "I'm not looking for anything," Mitchell said, when I asked him why he was really doing this. "I just don't want to be the kind of man who watched a 10-year-old get erased from her own family and did nothing because it wasn't my place to say something." Preston and Ashley, 11 and 8 that spring, didn't understand the full shape of what had happened, and I made sure Diane and Roger kept it that way for as long as they reasonably could. What they understood was smaller and, in its own way, more important: that their cousin Lily had been treated badly by their grandfather, that their mother had decided that was not acceptable, and that Aunt Claire's house was, from then on, a place where everyone was welcome without conditions attached. Ashley, who idolized Lily the way younger cousins do, started asking to have sleepovers at our house almost every other weekend, and I watched the two of them build blanket forts in my living room with a kind of fierce, uncomplicated loyalty that no legal document could have manufactured. It was Preston, actually, 12 years old and quieter than his sister, who said something to me one afternoon that I've thought about often since. We were in my kitchen waiting for the girls to finish a movie, and he asked, out of nowhere, whether Grandpa Walter had really said that thing about Lily. I told him the truth gently. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "That's stupid. She's my cousin. It doesn't matter how she got to be my cousin." I didn't correct his grammar. I just told him he was exactly right, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything I'd said to an adult in months. The legal bills were another complication nobody warns you about when you're busy being righteous. Between Harold's fees, the accounting fees for the formal trust review, and the eventual civil suit Frank helped the trust's new independent trustee file against Walter personally to recover diverted funds, I spent close to $60,000 over that year. Money I didn't have sitting in an account waiting to be spent. I took on extra forensic engagements at Whitfield and Cross, said yes to weekend consulting work I would have turned down a year earlier, and sat down with Lily more than once to explain, in language a 10 and then 11-year-old could hold on to, why some months were tighter than others, and why that had nothing to do with anything she'd done. She never once complained. She started keeping her own small budget for her allowance without me asking her to, lining up coins on her dresser in careful stacks, and when I asked her why, she said matter-of-factly, "I want to help if we need it," and I had to leave the room for a minute before she saw me cry. I started Lily in weekly sessions with a child therapist that spring too, a decision I probably should have made the moment the custody papers landed on my doorstep instead of months later, once I finally admitted to myself that she was carrying more than she was showing me at the dinner table. She'd started asking, out of nowhere, whether I would ever send her back if things got hard between us, a question that nearly buckled my knees the first time she asked it, casually, over cereal, like she was asking about the weather. Her therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Anand, helped both of us find language for things we'd been carrying silently. Lily's fear that love could be revoked the way Walter had tried to revoke his, and my own fear that I hadn't done enough, fast enough, to keep the ugliest parts of that year away from her. It took months of Tuesday afternoons before Lily stopped flinching at the word family meeting, which I hadn't even realized had become a trigger until Dr. Anand pointed it out. We started calling them something else. Kitchen table talks. It sounds small. It mattered enormously. By the time the trust litigation finally settled that autumn, nearly a year after that Thanksgiving dinner, Walter had lost almost everything that had ever made him feel untouchable. The company was gone. The Congress Street site sat under someone else's name. The court had ordered him to personally repay the trust for the diverted funds, a sum that ate through most of what remained of his liquid assets. He sent one letter that October, not to me but to Lily, care of my address, 3 typed paragraphs that read more like a legal disclaimer than an apology, citing his age and his grief over my mother and his complicated feelings about family that he was working through. I read it first, the way I read everything that reached her now, and then I sat her down and asked her, honestly, if she wanted to see it. She thought about it for a long time, chewing on the end of her pencil the way she did when she was working through a hard math problem, and then she said, "Not yet. Maybe someday. Not yet." I told her that was exactly the right answer, that someday could wait as long as she needed it to, and I put the letter in a drawer in case she ever changed her mind. It's been almost 2 years now since that Thanksgiving dinner, dinner. And I want to tell you, it feels like ancient history, but grief and vindication don't work that way. They sit next to each other in the same drawer, and some days I reach in and only touch one of them. Lily is 12 now. She plays midfield on a travel soccer team that takes up most of our weekends, and she is, against every hard thing that has happened to her, one of the most stubbornly joyful people I have ever known. She still keeps that careful little stack of allowance coins on her dresser, though these days it's less about worry and more about saving for a new pair of cleats, which feels like its own kind of victory, watching her budget for wants instead of fears. She knows the outline of what happened with her grandfather, in age-appropriate pieces I've added to as she's gotten old enough to hold them. She doesn't ask about him often. When she does, it's usually some small, practical question, whether he's still alive, whether he still lives in that house with the fireplace, and I answer honestly and let her decide each time how much more she wants to know. I've told her, more than once, that the door to knowing him someday is hers to open or leave closed for as long as she needs, and that nothing about her worth was ever, for one single second, up for debate in that decision. I moved from senior manager to director at Whitfield & Cross that spring, largely on the strength of the financial crimes work that grew out of what I found while trying to save my own daughter, which is a strange kind of professional silver lining I never asked for and don't know quite how to feel about most days. I still serve as co-trustee of my mother's trust, alongside the neutral professional trustee the court appointed, and every quarter when the distribution paperwork crosses my desk, I make a point of reading my mother's original language one more time. Any child legally adopted by a descendant, whether adopted before or after the execution of this instrument. 11 words that outlasted a company, outlasted an empire, outlasted a man who thought he could quietly write around them once she wasn't there to stop him. My mother never met a courtroom in her life outside of that one conference room with Frank Delacroix, and she still managed, from a hospital bed, to outmaneuver my father 5 years before he ever tried the thing she'd already made impossible. Diane and I are close again, in a different shape than before, one built on fewer assumptions and more actual conversation. She brings Preston and Ashley over most Sundays, and Ashley has taken to introducing Lily to new people as my cousin. We're basically sisters, a sentence she says with a kind of blunt confidence that makes something in my chest ache every single time, in the good way. Roger and I talk more than we used to as well, mostly about nothing, soccer schedules, and grill recipes, but I think we both understand what his silence cost him during those years. He stayed quiet about my father's requests, and what it means that he finally stopped staying quiet. Walter lives alone now, in the townhouse on Mount Vernon Street, considerably smaller than it once felt with an empire attached to it. I know this only because Diane still checks on him occasionally, out of an obligation I don't share and don't judge her for carrying. I haven't spoken to him since that meeting in Frank's office. I don't know if I ever will again, and I've made a strange kind of peace with not knowing, the way you make peace with a wound that healed crooked but healed all the same. Here's the thing I've come to understand, the thing I didn't fully understand even standing in that mediation room watching a shell company unravel in real time. My father spent his whole life believing that blood was the only currency that mattered, the only thing that made a person truly yours, truly worth protecting, truly worth the trouble. He built an actual empire on that belief, buildings and companies, and a fortune large enough to make grown men nervous in his presence. And in the end, none of it was strong enough to survive contact with the truth, because the truth was never about blood at all. It was about who shows up, who gets down on the floor to build a fairy garden out of broken pottery, who sits in a courtroom answering questions from a guardian ad litem, not because the law requires it, but because a 6-year-old asked, in her own way, to be chosen. Blood didn't build my family. Showing up did, over and over, on the ordinary days nobody was watching. And that turned out to be the one asset my father never learned how to counterfeit. I think about that word sometimes, the one he used at the table, the one that was supposed to make Lily small in front of everyone she loved. A stray is something with no home, no one looking for it, nothing tying it to anywhere at all. He couldn't have been more wrong about her if he'd tried for 100 years. She has a home with a hallway wall that still holds a framed adoption decree across from her bedroom door, the very first thing she sees every morning. She has a mother who spent a year in family court and would spend 10 more without hesitating. She has cousins who call her their sister and mean it, an aunt who cried on the sidelines of a soccer game, and a grandmother who protected her from beyond the grave with 11 careful words in a legal document nobody thought to double-check. She was never astray for one single day of her life. She was only ever and always exactly where she belonged. I've had to sit with my own part and how long it took me to see him clearly too. For 4 years, I made excuses for a man who never once made an excuse for himself because it was easier to believe he'd come around than to accept that some people simply won't. I told Lily when she was old enough to ask why we kept going to his house after the fairy garden birthday that grandfathers just needed extra time. That wasn't protection. That was me avoiding a truth I didn't want to carry alone. I don't do that anymore, with her or with anyone. If I've learned one lasting thing from all of this, it's that loving someone doesn't require pretending you don't see what they actually are. I won't pretend the ending is entirely clean, because it isn't. And I think stories that pretend otherwise do a disservice to anyone living through something similar. I lost a father that Thanksgiving, in every sense that matters, even though the man is still alive and living 4 miles from my house. I grieve that loss quietly, on nights I don't expect it, usually triggered by something small, a commercial for a car dealership he used to sponsor, a building downtown. I pass on my commute that still has his name carved into the cornerstone, even though the company inside answers to someone else now. Some part of me will always wish there had been a version of him capable of loving my daughter the way she deserved, uncomplicated and unconditional, the way my mother managed to, right up until the day she died. That version never existed. I had to stop waiting for him to become it. But I got something in exchange for that loss that I wouldn't trade back. Not for anything. Not for a single untroubled Thanksgiving. I got proof, written in bank records and trust documents, and a shaking woman's confession in a fluorescent lit room, that love holds up under audit even when cruelty doesn't. I got a daughter who knows in her bones, in a way I hope she never has to test again, that she is not conditional, and I got to be the one who stood up, chair falling backward, and said the only sentence that ever really mattered in that whole ordeal, the one I'd say again without hesitating every single time. She is my daughter. Not a stray, never a stray, just mine, completely, on paper and in every other way that has ever counted.